The morning opened soft and silver, with mist hovering just above the river like breath held between heaven and earth. The air was cool, but not biting. The sort of morning that makes you wrap your shawl a little tighter and step slowly because everything feels sacred. The river bend clearing was still damp from yesterday's washing. Mom had hung the last of the shirts on the makeshift line before sunset, and now they swayed lightly in the early breeze, sunlight just beginning to reach through the trees in narrow golden slits. Agnes was already awake. Of course she was. Polecats are crepuscular, which means they come alive at dawn and dusk. Agnes had clearly decided this was her hour. She was nose down in the grass, weaving and darting, her long body rippling like liquid fur. Every so often she'd freeze. Perfect stillness. Then explode forward for no reason at all. Pearl, still half asleep, watched with that bulldog expression that says, I do not understand you, but I will tolerate you. Agnes sprang toward Pearl's jowls, then veered off at the last second and somersaulted sideways. Pearl snorted. Agnes, I said under my breath, if you spray today, you're walking alone. The desert father was already seated on a stone near the water, back straight, hands folded. He hadn't moved since I first noticed him this morning. His face was lean and severe, though not unkind, just carved by sun and silence. Sean was building up a small fire for tea. He'd insisted Mom not lift the heavier kettle. I can still lift a kettle, you know, Mom said mildly. I know you can, he replied. That's not the point. She looked up at him with that twinkle. Are you trying to be gallant, or are you just trying to make me feel ancient? Gallant, he said. Definitely gallant. Dad came up behind her and rested his hand lightly at her back. He's just practicing for when he's 80, he said. Better to start young. Mom laughed and leaned into him briefly, and I saw Sean smile just a little. We gathered gradually, cups warming our hands. It was Lucia who finally spoke to the desert father. You were alone in the desert, she said quietly. For years. Why? He didn't answer immediately. He watched the water instead. I knew he was thinking. He had already answered this, but she wanted more. Because, he said at last, the world is loud. That's it? Liam asked. The father's eyes flicked toward him. You think silence is easy? No, Liam admitted. The father shifted. When I left the city, I thought I was escaping temptation. But in the desert, I discovered I had carried it with me. Francis smiled faintly. He recognized this in his own experience. In the desert, the father continued, there's no applause, no distraction, no hiding, only God and yourself. And demons, Sean muttered. The father nodded once. Yes. Lucia leaned forward, eyes wide. We did not go into the desert to earn salvation, he said. We went because we were already claimed by Christ. We went to learn to love him without the noise. Dad spoke gently. So it was about reordering the heart? The father looked at him carefully, then inclined his head. Yes. Reparation, perhaps. That word hung there again. I asked, can you explain what you mean by that? He turned toward me fully now. To repair what sin has damaged, he said, not to purchase forgiveness, that has already been given, but to stand in the gap, to say, Lord, I grieve what grieves you. Mom grew very quiet. Let my heart be broken by the things that break the heart of God, she said, quietly quoting Bob Pierce. Godly knowledge, I asked. Yes, he nodded. It's like fasting on Fridays, Maria said softly, not to earn anything, but to remember, to unite ourselves with his suffering. The father's severe face softened just a fraction. Yes. Francis added, reparation is love responding to love, not wages. Claire, who had been silent, said quietly, and sometimes it is love responding to wounds we did not personally inflict. We make reparation for the world. Agnes chose that solemn moment to leap into the shallow edge of the river and chase a leaf. She slipped, splashed, and emerged looking offended. Pearl barked once. The desert father did not smile, but his eyes did. We began walking mid-morning. The air warmed quickly, sunlight flashing through poplar leaves overhead. The ground was uneven, small stones shifting underfoot. Sean instinctively moved closer to Mom on steeper stretches. We had all begun to notice his protectiveness, and though my mom was a seasoned hiker, I knew she appreciated it. The path narrowed not long after we left the riverbed. The trees thinned, and the land opened into a wide stretch of scrub and stone. The morning mist had burned off, and the sky was sharp and blue, but there was a stillness in the air that felt watchful. The ground here was uneven, low ridges of pale rock rising like ribs out of the earth, difficult for me to get my walker across with its wheels. The wind moved differently, too. Instead of rustling leaves, it whispered across dry grasses in long, slow strokes. We had been talking lightly, but the conversation faded as the path curved along a shallow slope. Ahead of us, Francis stopped without warning. He didn't raise his hand dramatically. He simply stopped walking. David nearly bumped into him. "What is it?" Sean asked. Francis tilted his head slightly to the right. We heard it then, not loud, a low, distant rumble. At first I thought it was wind caught in a hollow, but it wasn't steady. It shifted, thickened. The Desert Father stepped forward beside Francis. His face sharpened. "Dust," he said, and pointed. Over the rise to our east, a thin wall of pale brown was beginning to lift from the ground, not towering, not catastrophic, but wide. Liam squinted. "A storm?" "Small," the father said, "but close." My instinct was immediate. "Move." "Shouldn't we hurry?" I asked. The father shook his head once more. "No." The wind changed direction almost instantly, brushing against our faces now instead of our backs. The air felt charged, like it does just before something breaks. Sean looked around for shelter. There wasn't much, a shallow depression in the rock, a few boulders. "Down there," David said, pointing to a slight hollow where the earth dipped and curved inward. We moved quickly, but without running. Packs shifted, boots scraped stone. Agnes, who had been darting ahead in wide, carefree arcs, froze mid-step, her nose lifted, scenting the air. Pearl pressed close to Mom's leg without being told. By the time we reached the hollow, the rumble had grown. The wind picked up in sharp bursts, tugging at scarves and sleeves. "Sit," the Desert Father said firmly. "Low." We crouched along the curve of the earth. Dad pulled Mom close to the inward side of the rock. Sean positioned himself slightly outward from her without making a show of it. Lucia knelt beside me, her dark hair already whipping loose from its tie. We hugged each other silently, our foreheads touching, protecting our faces. The wall of dust rolled toward us, not violent, but relentless. It wasn't dramatic enough to justify panic. That almost made it harder. My heart wanted to run. The father's voice cut through the rising wind. "Do not move." The first wave hit like a dry breath across the face, even in Lucia's and my protective position. Fine grit stung my cheeks. I shut my eyes instinctively. The wind roared briefly, then steadied into a harsh rush. Dust filled the air, not blinding, but thick enough that the world shrank to a few feet in every direction. Lucia's hand found mine. I think I'm the only one who heard her humming, "He hideth my soul in the cleft of the rock." "This is stupid," Liam muttered under his breath. "We could outrun it." Francis leaned toward him calmly. "Outrun? Where?" There was nowhere to go. The wind pressed harder. I felt the urge to shift, to shield my face differently, to stand up and reposition. "Stay," the father said again, firmly. It felt like forever. It was probably less than 5 minutes. Dust crept into collars, into sleeves. It scraped softly against exposed skin. The sound of it sliding over stone was like dry paper being crumpled. And in that forced stillness, something in me rebelled. Why weren't we fighting this? Why weren't we doing something? I cracked one eye open. The father hadn't moved at all. His robe flapped sharply, but his posture was unmoved. Francis sat beside him, hands folded loosely, eyes half closed. They were both peaceful, amazingly so. Sean's jaw was set, but he stayed, blocking the wind from harassing my mom. Dad's hand rested steadily over hers, unafraid. Lucia was breathing slowly beside me. David had silently, protectively drawn Maria over toward us and had placed his arms around us three women. My dad and mom had pulled Aoife into their embrace. The wind peaked, a final surge, then began to thin. The roar softened to a hiss. Light returned in pieces. When the dust finally passed beyond us, the world looked slightly altered. Edges softened, colors muted, but intact. We didn't stand immediately. The father waited. We had learned respect for him in those moments, and we trusted him now. We wouldn't move until he did. Only when the air settled fully did he rise, brushing dust from his sleeves. Liam stood and looked out across the slope. That's it? That's it, the father replied. That was hardly anything, Liam said. The father turned to him. You wanted something heroic? Liam flushed slightly. Francis smiled gently. There are storms you overcome by strength, and there are storms you survive by not moving. The father added, Many flee at the first discomfort. They call it wisdom. Often it is fear, and sometimes they pay for it. We climbed out of the hollow slowly. The path ahead was visible again, pale and quiet as before. I realized something then, that my impulse to run hadn't been about safety. It had been about control. Staying still had required more from me than moving would have. Lucia brushed dust from her skirt. It felt like the world was closing in. Yes, Claire said softly from behind her, and yet it passed. Sean helped Mom step back onto the path. You okay? She smiled up at him. I've had worse hair days. He laughed, relieved. Agnes emerged from somewhere under a rock, fur powdered pale, looking deeply offended by the entire concept of weather. Pearl sneezed dramatically and shook herself, sending a fresh cloud into the air. As we resumed walking, I found myself quieter, not shaken, just aware. The desert father walked beside me for a few steps. You wished to run, he said, not accusing, simply stating. Yes, and yet you stayed. I didn't have much choice. He looked at me, then my walker. There is always a choice. We walked in silence for a while longer. Ahead, the path curved, and just beyond that curve, after we had learned what it meant to remain, we would meet a man who had done precisely that. Francis slowed and broke the silence. Today, he said lightly, we speak of Scripture. Dad adjusted his pack, and how it reaches people. That was when we saw him. He wasn't dramatic. He didn't arrive with thunder. He simply stepped into view along the path ahead. Young, dark-haired, mustached, wearing a t-shirt and jeans, and looking as though he had just stepped out of a 1981 photograph. My breath caught. Dad stopped walking. Mom pressed her fingers to her mouth. He smiled, that easy, energetic smile. Good morning, he said. His voice was warm, steady. Dad was the first to speak. Chet. They shook hands. I realized Dad knew him personally from heaven. For a moment, no one moved. Lucia looked from one of us to another. Who is he? I swallowed. He's a missionary. Chet extended his hand to Liam first, then to Sean. Firm handshake, confident. I worked with Wycliffe, he said. Dad's eyes lit up. Bible translation. Yes. As we resumed walking, he fell in beside us naturally, as though he'd always been there. You learn a language, he explained, that has never been written down. You sit with people, you listen, you create an alphabet, you teach them to read their own words, and then, slowly, carefully, you translate scripture, not just literally, faithfully. Lucia's eyes shone. So the word sounds like their grandmother's language. I love that imagery, he grinned. That's what we call their heart language. Dad began explaining overseas crusades where he had worked, how mission organizations differ but share the same heart. He spoke in that steady, thoughtful way of his, not lecturing, just remembering. We'd left OC before everything, Dad said, but we understood the pressure. Mom chimed in about Loma Linda, where Chet had been stationed. about her and Dad visiting friends at SIL in the 1960s, about buying their house when they moved to Columbia. He hadn't been there when they had, but they could imagine it easily. You remember the orange trees? Dad asked her. And the avocado tree, she said, and how excited they were to go. Chet listened with affection. We were stationed in Loma Linda, but we're in Bogota at the right time, he said, because I needed surgery. The right time, Mom repeated. You could see the paradigm shift, and I'm sure I looked the same. His tone didn't shift dramatically, but something in the air did. They came pretending to be police, he continued. I told my wife to stay calm. Lucia's imagination flickered. I could see it, but she held it steady. They were looking for someone else, Dad said quietly. Your friend's father, he said to me, turning. Chet nodded. He wasn't there, but I was. He didn't dramatize it. After a moment of silence, Lucia, wide-eyed, asked, You were kidnapped? Chet nodded. Sean asked, Were you afraid? Chet considered. Of course, but fear isn't the boss. The Desert Father glanced at him sharply, approvingly. They said they were M19, Chet continued. They believed SIL, part of our translation mission, was CIA. Liam frowned. But it wasn't. No. Dad explained the accusations, the letters to President Reagan, the demands. Wycliffe was told by the terrorists to leave the country, Mom said softly, and the New York Times and Washington Post were told to publish M19's manifesto. They gave a month, Chet said. The path narrowed as we approached shallower water ahead, the poplar ford visible in the distance, stones laid like steps across the current. Wycliffe doesn't negotiate, David said quietly. No, Chet replied, we don't. And, he added, we knew that going in. Agnes darted ahead and leapt onto one of the stepping stones prematurely, misjudged, and nearly slid in. Pearl barked in alarm. Sean waited in mid-calf to steady the polecat, who looked deeply insulted at needing assistance. We paused there, midstream. The water was cool and clear, sunlight flashing on its surface. Lucia looked at Chet carefully. And you stayed? Willingly? He didn't answer that yet. Not fully. Instead, he stepped onto the first stone of the ford and turned back toward us. Translation is slow, he said, but the word endures. People can threaten bodies. They can't unwrite truth. Wycliffe is still there in Columbia. The Desert Father spoke then. Courage, he said quietly, is often simply staying. No one argued. We crossed the stream together. On the far side, we rested on the stones, feet dangling in the water. Agnes and Pearl settled separately, Agnes grooming herself furiously as if to remove any evidence of assistance, Pearl contentedly watching the flow. Chet looked downstream, quiet. We hadn't reached the end of his story, but we had reached something steadier, and the river kept moving.